Political analyst and Washington bureau chief for the Daily Beast, Jackie Kucinich, CNN political commentator and senior columnist for the Daily Beast, Matt Lewis. Matt, Sean Spicer comes out and said, well, let's play it. He's talking to ABC's Jonathan Karl. Here's what happened at the presser.
Back in January, the president said that nobody in his campaign had been in touch with the Russians. Now, today, can you still say definitively that nobody on the Trump campaign, not even General Flynn, had any contact with the Russians before the election?
My understanding is that what General Flynn has now expressed is that during the transition period, well, we were very clear that during the transition period, he did speak with the ambassador.
I'm talking about during the campaign.
I don't have any. There's nothing that would conclude me that anything different has changed with respect to that time period.
Sean probably made nothing that would convince me. But how can that be true if the reporting from the New York Times and our reporting with Sciutto and the rest of the team is true?
Right. And I think Mike Pence, the vice president, was out even farther on that, saying, I think he was asked in a Sunday show, and he flatly denied, no, there was no communication during the campaign. Now, of course, reports indicate that, in fact, there was. That in and of itself.
Constant is the word.
Right.
That the officials might be out of the loop.
It could be that he's not on top of all of what's happening with some of Donald Trump's the other wing.
Right.
So look, I think that in and of itself, even that isn't, is it the end of the world? The real question, though, obviously, is what were they saying? Were they coordinating the leaking of Hillary Clinton's information? That, of course, would be a complete game changer. But this does not look good in and of itself.
What else? What could they have been doing? I mean, now that we have intelligence officials telling CNN and the New York Times that, again, the word was constant contact, what could people on the Trump team have been in constant contact with Russian operatives about?
Well, and that is the biggest question. As Matt said, was this about the leaking of Hillary Clinton's information? There's no evidence to that yet, but they're still digging into this.
Because we don't know the content.
We don't know the content, but what this does politically is this reopens and restarts the conversation about what the Trump campaign was doing when it came to Russia during the campaign. And it's not just Democrats who are saying this. There are Republicans who want to look into this, too. And they don't want to be talking about this anymore.
Right, but look, and that's understandable. Right. But, facts lead to conclusions. What they were talking about, why they were talking about it, save it for another day. Right now, what you have, let's bring in Maggie Haberman, New York Times political reporter. Nice of you to join us.
Fresh off the street. Thanks for having me.
Good to see you. So the idea of whether they can be believed in the White House, if they are telling us the truth, is a fundamental bond of trust with the American people.
Yes.
So why this was happening and all that, we'll get to that. But the facts, constant communications and exchange between members of the campaign and Russian fill-in-the-blank, operatives, government people, whatever. Sean Spicer says, I know of nothing that would, and he misspoke, I think, saying, convince me that this is true. How can both of those things be true?
Well, I think you hit on the most important thing, which is the public trust aspect of this job. And I think that this White House has had a really hard time embracing that and seeing this as an act of public trust, that you are in the people's building, that you are doing the people's work. We have seen stories change repeatedly over the last couple of days. What we heard from Sean Spicer yesterday is very different than what I was hearing and my colleagues were hearing the night before about what happened with Flynn, just on a simplistic issue, which was, did the president ask for his resignation? There is no evidence that he actually did ask for it, that it seems aides asked for it, yet according to the narrative that came out in the briefing room yesterday, the president was decisive. So I think that you raise a fundamental point, which is, I don't think the White House understands how eroded their sense of credibility is over the last 3 weeks. 3 weeks. We are 3.5 weeks into this administration, and it's very hard to get it back, not to mention that whatever other work they want to be doing right now, you're right, they don't want to be talking about this. They'd like to be talking about repealing the Affordable Health Care Act, or they'd like to be talking about infrastructure, or they'd like to be talking about a tax reform plan. There isn't even work going on those, as best as I can tell. It's impossible to tell who's actually in charge in this White House. In a way, all of the cloud on this obscures other major questions about how this White House is running, but this is hardly a good place to be. And there seemed to be yesterday a lack of appreciation for the fact that this is not the campaign anymore, and yet they all seem to be in campaign mode still, jockeying for position, fighting with each other, and not really understanding why it is that say firing your national security advisor 3 weeks in is not the same as firing Paul Manafort or firing Corey Lewandowski or firing whomever. And there is a reluctance to understand why this isn't just changing the news cycle. It's a big deal.
Jim Sciutto, you are in the thick of reporting on all of this, and I know that Chris is saying we shouldn't get out ahead of it and talk about the content, but do we know anything about, I mean, other than the constant contact that was being made between the Trump team and the Russian operatives, do we know what they were talking about?
We don't know yet, but let's look at this progression here. A month ago, we reported that the contents of this now famous dossier compiled by a British intelligence agent alleging that Russia believes it has compromising information on the president, that was briefed to the president and president-elect. They hadn't made any conclusions about the contents of that, but they considered it important enough to let the president-elect or the then president-elect know about it. A couple weeks later, we learned that they had begun to corroborate some of the aspects of that dossier. Initially, they'd said, we won't comment on the veracity, we just let them know. Progression since then is that they have confirmed that some, not all, but some of what's in that dossier, specifically Russia to Russian contacts, were corroborated by intercepted communications. Now we know that it wasn't just Russians talking to Russians, it was Trump campaign people talking to Russians, and not just here and there occasionally, that happens during any campaign, but repeatedly, constantly, and at a very high level. And keep in mind the context of this. If that kind of communication happened in any other year but 2016, you might begin to think you could forget about it, although it still raises a lot of questions. But it happened in the midst of an unprecedented Russian interference in the U.S. presidential election. This is happening in real time, and the Trump campaign is talking to Russia. Right. We don't know that there was any collusion, but even if there wasn't, that's a strange time for a U.S. presidential campaign to be speaking to officials and others with an adversarial foreign government.
Right, and the contrast that you've picked up on through your reporting is also as newsworthy as anything here, because all of this is being said. CNN's not the only ones reporting it. And you have Paul Manafort says this is absolutely not true, at least about me. I didn't knowingly talk to any Russians. You have Sean Spicer, who yesterday stared the press in the face and said, I don't know of anything that would make me think that we had any exchange. And then there was this from the Vice President Mike Pence talking to Chris Wallace. Listen to this.
Was there any contact in any way between Trump or his associates and the Kremlin or cutouts?
Of course not. Why would there be any contacts between the campaign? Chris, this is all a distraction, and it's all a part of a narrative to delegitimize the election and to question the legitimacy of this presidency.
Jim, do you think that what is your confidence in the reporting versus all of these stark denials? Does this go to the sufficiency of the reporting, or does this go to who's in the loop in the Trump side of the equation?
Chris, I have zero doubt in my colleague Pamela Brown and Evan Perez's reporting. We have multiple officials, current and former, from multiple agencies in Washington, law enforcement, intelligence, and administration telling us this. And as you know, we at CNN take this kind of stuff very seriously. We don't go to air with stuff unless we're very confident. So we believe very strongly there is, and intelligence officials telling us that these calls and these conversations took place at a level and with a frequency that alarmed them. Now, you see Vice President Pence there saying, no, there were no conversations. You see Sean Spicer yesterday saying, to his knowledge, there weren't any conversations. It may very well be true that to neither of their knowledge, that they just didn't know, right? And apparently that was the case with the conversations with Flynn, that we now know that Flynn was not forthcoming with his colleagues in the administration. So it's possible that some elements of the campaign didn't tell other elements.
Do you believe that Flynn was all out on his own, that nobody knew what he was doing, that nobody discussed with Mike Flynn what the agenda was with Russia and what operations and communications to have? You really think he was just a rogue agent?
Do I believe that personally? I can't answer that question because I don't know. But I do know that both Democrats and Republicans, we heard Lindsey Graham, we heard John McCain raise that very question. Would Flynn have gone out there without some direction from more senior people in the White House? They raised that question. It's a reasonable question. It needs to be answered.
Yeah, and yet, Matt, Jason Chaffetz of the House, who has launched many an investigation, says, you know what, this is over. Mike Flynn resigned. End of story.
Yeah.
What's
That's
that?
what he says today. This could snowball. Donald Trump has a real problem. I mean, first of all, he's very lucky that Republicans control, Congress right now.
And he's got Senator Rand Paul, saying Republicans shouldn't be investigating Republicans. So much for his independent spirit.
But I think this could shift very quickly, not in Donald Trump's favor. The problem is, unlike almost any other politician of either party, he doesn't have a natural constituency amongst Republican politicians or conservative opinion leaders. And so the relationship that they have with Donald Trump is transactional, right? We support him not out of personal loyalty, but because we want to get a good...
he's going to get things done.
Neil Gorsuch is going to be our Supreme Court justice. What happens, though, when the pain of supporting Donald Trump, if it happens, overwhelms the benefits? So, in other words, I think that the problem is these Republican leaders don't have the normal loyalty that you would have to a president of your party. That's not good for Donald Trump if this, continues.
But even so, they still don't want to be talking about someone else's mistakes or someone else's problems day after day. I mean, you saw all over Paul Ryan's face yesterday that he had to address this again instead of tax reform.
Maggie, context on this. The same fundamental question when this first came up remains. Who knew about what Flynn was doing? People close to him say the idea that he was on his own is absurd, but they're banking on loyalty, his most of all, and by all accounts, Michael Flynn is willing to take one for the team.
Seems so right now. Look, but I think to Matt's point, this could snow. We don't know. And to Jim's point, we don't know. It's an unanswerable question, but it is a legitimate one that I think is going to continue to get pressed. I think what we are seeing here, too, is the extent to which it is very dangerous for a president to be essentially at war with his own intelligence community. And Donald Trump took office with that as the backdrop. And you are seeing that play out in real time. I mean, you had elements of the intelligence community that were opposed to Hillary Clinton. You saw that come out during the campaign. This is now the flip side of that coin. There's a lot we don't know, to be clear. There is no evidence so far that anything improper was discussed. A lot of it raises more questions, but it does keep the focus on things they don't want to be discussing.
And we do know this. They were told that Mike Flynn was having these conversations about sanctions, and they did nothing for days.
Panel, thank you very much. Stick around. We have more questions. The fallout from Michael Flynn's resignation as National Security Advisor becoming a crisis for the Trump